Oops, why aren't? Hey, Rufus.
You're right. Okay, sorry.
Okay, let me just get,
Hello.
there I am. We're just getting Tim set up. He's going to be here. And I'm going to be over there. Just want to get your books up.
No, okay, cool. That's good. I have one I have one as well.
We'll see what happens. Sometimes you got to wait a few minutes for people to arrive. Not everyone is.
Yeah, there's 4 people, so we'll just give it another minute or so.
Where's the people? Oh, there you go.
And I will. Okay.
Some people are coming in. If you're watching this, just give us a few minutes. Just giving people a few minutes to arrive and get settled, and we'll start.
Oh, someone's here from South Korea.
That's my sister.
Go ahead.
Yeah, my sister is my sister Amanda's in South Korea teaching right now. So,
Oh, wow.
yeah, she's a world traveler.
Where did you see the questions? Oh, I see. I guess that's 7.
Yeah, if you wanted to start.
Do you want to start? We got a few people coming in. Maybe they're late, but we could always start.
Yeah.
I see you, and that's all important. I just see you. Well,
Yeah.
for people who have arrived and people who are late, hello, my name is Tim from the City in the City Bookstore on the fabulous Ottawa Strip, Hamilton, Ontario. Here to talk to one of our pals, but also one of our best customers and someone who's written a fantastic book. But to begin, I will read the land acknowledgement, as we always do at events here. The city of Hamilton is situated upon the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas. The land is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which was agreement between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe to share the care for the resources around the Great Lakes. We further acknowledge that this land is covered by the Between the Lakes Purchase, 1792, between the Crown and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Today, the city of Hamilton is home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, North America, and we recognize that we must do more to learn about the rich history of this land so we can better understand our role as residents, neighbors, partners, and caretakers. And I apologize if that was slightly rough. Janet usually runs our event, so I don't usually have to read the land acknowledgement. But what we're here to do today is celebrate and have a little chat under not the best circumstance about this book, The Paris Bureau, by our man Rufus. And you may not know, we've been informed that Rufus has had a bit of the COVID, a mild case. So he said he might have a brain freeze, but we can deal with that.
Yeah, I should be fine. I am not dangerous. I am no longer, public health has declared that I'm not a threat. I no longer am infectious, I suppose. So, but still kind of dealing with a few of the symptoms, and brain fog is one of them.
Well, that's okay. We all have brain fog.
Yeah.
It is actually funny. I mean, as you were joking right before we got on, that I wasn't sure whether that's something you wanted to talk about. It's not a big deal, but it struck me as very appropriate for an introduction, because in the beginning of the book, your great grandfather is put down with a mild case of the Spanish flu. So this is everything is akimbo. Everything is working.
Yeah, and I like I said, when I was writing that and I was researching it, it was pre-COVID. So there was a lot of notes that I had to like explain to the readers about, pandemics and how they work and all the stuff that now is just completely common knowledge. And then, I guess, yeah, ironically enough, the COVID is actually I've that history. I guess I'm now included in that history of COVID. So
Well, it brings you together because there's a theme through the book of the family tradition. I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I guess, you would probably do it better than I, but I mean, we should just give, people who aren't familiar a brief introduction about the book. I mean, what I think is fascinating is the phrase biography of a footnote. And I'm sure you could explain what that means better than I can.
Yeah, well, my great grandfather and my great grandparents both ran the Brooklyn Daily Eagle's Paris bureau from 1918 to 1933. And so they were friends with a lot of the writers over there, including a young Ernest Hemingway, who used to hang out in the bureau and was fairly good friends with my great grandfather in that time. And so whenever he shows up in books, it'll be about how it's sort of a brief note about how he was friends with one of Hemingway's friends. And for some reason, I thought quite a few mentions of his mustache, that he was his friend from the Brooklyn Daily Eagle who had a luxurious mustache, which is not really in most of the pictures. So I'm not really sure where that comes from. But so I've been hearing stories for years and years and years about my great grandparents and their friends. And I found while I was in graduate school that all of the stuff had been put online, that the Brooklyn Public Library, through, I think it's newspapers.com, digitized the entire run of the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, and they were all available online. So I just kind of started searching and reading every issue for those years for his articles. And I had the idea when I was done with grad school that I was going to do a print on demand book of his articles for my family. That was the big idea. I got done with my dissertation and I said, well, okay, I'm going to take a break, do this thing for my family. And my dissertation director said, well, why don't you just write a book about it? I thought, oh, okay, well, that's an interesting idea, because she was, saying that people are fascinated with the jazz age and Paris and all that sort of thing. And so I thought, okay, well, yeah, maybe I will. So I did. The first time I wrote, the first draft of the book was pretty academic and pretty dry, because I did my PhD in history, and I thought, okay, well, I'll just write this academic book and he'll be the source. And it didn't really work. I sent it to an agent who responded, I think you're a really good writer, but I think this is a really interesting story, but I don't connect with it in any way. And I can't tell why. I thought, yeah, you know what? I don't either. So I took a break and worked on rewriting the dissertation, and then came back. And once I came back, it was all much easier. It was about a year. I took about a year and then came back, and I thought, oh, okay, well, I don't really care that much about all of the historical, sort of academic kind of analysis of the historical context. I want to hear about these people, and I want to hear about my great grandparents. And I hope that I'm interested enough in it that other people will be interested enough when they read it.
Yeah, for sure. And that works. And I mean, I can tell you, I mean, it's early days, but as a bookseller, I've sold a few copies to people who are not academics by any stretch of the mind, and they really enjoyed it. It's a compelling story. It's a story about a man going to Europe and having a career. It's a story about you looking at your family. It actually does work. It's a fantastic just trade story. But one thing I wanted to ask you about is, I think the word bureau is interesting, because it's something we all sort of know what a bureau is,
Yeah.
but it's different. I mean, I was fascinated about just how the bureau worked and what his job was. Like, not like the war correspondent flies off to the hotspot and flies out. Like, how does that differ from journalism today?
It was a surprise to me how much it was like a travel bureau.
Yeah, it had other purposes.
Yeah, it was, they had this office, and it was sort of second floor office where they had a reading room, You came in through the front door. They had a big desk like a travel bureau where you signed in if you were visiting from Brooklyn, if you were a tourist, and they would print in the paper that you'd arrived, so your family back home could read about it. And then my great grandmother, as well as my great grandfather and my great great grandmother, who also joined them and worked in the office, they knew where to go for to eat and where to go for affordable hotels and all those sort of things. So it was a lot of taking people around for lunches and things like that. There was a lot of meeting with businessmen from Brooklyn and taking them to lunch and then taking them for sort of tourist kind of activities that you wouldn't think of as being sort of the normal responsibility of a news bureau, but it was there was quite a lot of that going on. They did quite a lot of work aside from just reporting news. But
as you mentioned,
go ahead.
oh, sorry, as you mentioned at one point, what the part that struck with me was after the war, writing not about soldiers who had died, but reporting on soldiers they found alive. Like it's a direct line to Brooklyn, like they're just saying, yes, this guy from Brooklyn is alive and well. We saw him yesterday. Don't worry, everything's good. I mean, that's amazing because they're writing about the big picture, like the peace treaty, but also writing directly to neighborhoods to give people information they need. It goes both ways, people coming from Brooklyn and information going back to Brooklyn.
It's amazing with the Brooklyn Daily Eagle how involved they were in the life of the community. So that they had at home, they had lecture series where you could go watch, a lot of the reporters would give these lectures free for the public, and then they would have spelling bees for the kids. And they would have these tours. They had sort of tour groups that they sent to places, like Egypt and to the Grand Canyon, where they would have a bunch of tourists that would be taken from, the Brooklyn Daily Eagle had their summer trip. And so it was sort of the same thing where they would publish things in there where it was just here's somebody who showed up and here's how they're doing and they want to say hi to the family back home. And then with the soldiers, it was almost a sort of a check-in station for the soldiers to not only did they send information back home, but a lot of them were coming there for meals, and they would have parties and things like that at the end of the war. And then my great grandmother, when she went over, she got very involved in the American soldiers who had stayed after the war and got in trouble and ended up getting arrested for various reasons and sent to. So she would write stories for the people back home about please send money to help this poor American boy who is now in French in jail in France, or is facing jail. So she ended up spending a lot of time going to trials and delivering letters and things back and forth for the former soldiers.
So it's like a travel agency, a expatriate information center. I thought that was fascinating. So I didn't really know a lot about that. I mean, I guess all the purposes it served. When we tend to think about the lost generation, we can't help think about young intrepid writers going off because there's cheap apartments and lots of cheap booze, but we don't think about the actual real end of the war. The 20s and the war seem separate, like the idea that there's damaged U.S. soldiers wandering around the streets of Paris and someone has to find them. Like that's wild.
Yeah, that was one of the things I found pretty interesting too. Is he had some stories in there about there was one where he was going to one of the peace treaties, one of the endless meetings in Italy, and runs into an American soldier who had stayed over, who was a Texan, and was pretty much living on the beach and pretty much drinking himself into oblivion. And it's a really affecting story about this guy who really kind of had a purpose during the war and then kind of really didn't feel that he had one, and so was sort of this is so I guess that was kind of literally that was one of the lost of the lost generation. And they wrote quite a bit too about how many people there were in France that were just struggling to get by, and I think he was pretty I think he was just sort of naturally fascinated with those people.
Yeah, that's wild. But I guess to get out of that into the bigger picture, once he gets there, he ends up part of the milieu that we all know and have read lots about. I mean, the literary lost generation. I mean, how exactly does he connect with them? Or is it just like you just went down to the cafe and everyone was there? That's the sense we have. You just went for a beer and everyone was there and it all happened.
That's kind of he almost talks about it that way. He almost talks about the writing colony as having these sort of certain places they hung out. But I think a lot of it too was that there were a lot of people that were involved with writing for newspapers. There were a lot of people that you think of as great writers who were working at newspapers, and so I guess they showed up in 1918. They were a little bit ahead of the crowd. And so they were kind of a useful resource anyway for Americans who were showing up, who were trying to figure out how to find cheap lodging and things like that. So it was so I mean with Hemingway, Hemingway came over as a cub journalist, and they became friends pretty quickly. But it's sort of interesting because he wrote a little bit about Henry V. Miller from Brooklyn, who came over, decided he wanted to be a writer, and my great grandparents kind of took him in and showed him around, and I apparently had gave him dinner and things like that, and wrote a few articles about this guy. He used to work for the Telegraph Company, and now he's over here. But he was a proofreader, I think, for one of the newspapers. He was working. A lot of people kind of came over that were writers and would get these kind of brief jobs to kind of make ends meet that way.
I wonder too, it always strikes me too, like, I mean, the number of people, who met through being cub reporters. We were talking before we got on, of course, Canada, about our guy, Morley Callahan, who met Hemingway at the Toronto Star. But that's where you went. And the number of people, if you were a young writer, you tried to get a journalism job to cut your teeth and become a writer. And with the demise of print media, it's kind of funny. We don't have that place. Like, if you want to be a writer, you can't go get a job.
Yeah.
Maybe you go get an MFA. I don't think it's the same thing, but I don't know. It seems like there's a great tradition. All those people gravitate towards the gig, like your great grandfather wouldn't have got there if he didn't have the gig.
Well, it was after the war, there was a huge interest too in what was going on in Europe. I mean, after in the States, there was a kind of a big interest, for kind of understandable reasons about, affairs in Europe. So a lot of these foreign news bureaus grew pretty dramatically after the war. And one of the things that I found that was kind of interesting that I had read in a few other books on the topic is it wasn't necessarily a good move for their career when they got back. A lot of those people, and my great grandfather was one of them, where it was a good gig when they started kind of tightening their belts after the Depression. Then people would come back, and they didn't necessarily have writing gigs waiting for them when they came back. It was sort of considered kind of at best kind of like a lateral move in their career, and so it was hard for a lot of them. But that era, it was a good gig. It never paid very very well, but it was a fairly cheap place to live at that time.
Oh, for sure. And I guess, we've sort of been skirting around some of the context of it, but I guess the big part, and the word Hemingway is in the title. So, I mean, it's kind of funny because it wasn't just like everyone, like, as I think you mentioned in the book too, like everyone has a Hemingway story. Yeah. But they were actually, Guy and him are actually real friends. They have a real relationship, and I think that's different than a lot of these books you read.
Yeah, I think the way I thought of it is I didn't want to say that like Hemingway that Guy was his best friend, although he did at one point say he was one of his closest friends. But for Guy, this was one of his best friends. I guess is how I kind of thought of it. For Guy, this was somebody who meant a great deal to him, at least at that time. And while like a lot of people, they kind of, with Hemingway, they did drift apart later on in the sort of later 30s. They didn't have a falling out, unlike a lot of people with Hemingway. There wasn't a big fight. They still were considered themselves friends. And so I think the first time, this is another thing that changed. The first time I tried to write a book about Hemingway, and it didn't really work. And then I kind of realized that Hemingway is sort of a supporting character in this book. which is kind of maybe not what you're used to with books on Hemingway, but he's a bit more of a supporting character for my great grandparents' story.
Mm. Yeah, because it seems to be both. Like there's just Hemingway, the guy, the pal, but there's also the mythology. Like I wonder what both what you think and what I suspect, like what would your great grandfather think of also the mythology of Hemingway, like whether he was part of building it or not. Because you mentioned a piece he writes called "Hemingway First Lives Wild Stories, Then Writes Them."
Yeah.
Like I mean, it seems like everyone was in on not just the mythology of this one guy, but this idea of a different idea of being a writer.
Yeah, he was one of the first. I mean, you think of somebody like maybe like Lord Byron, who was a celebrity before that, but Hemingway was really good at using this kind of machinery of publicity. It really was kind of the heyday of publicity, and he was good at using quite a few of his friends to kind of build his mythology, and Guy was one of them. I mean, Guy, you know, would write these articles that a lot of them were about these kind of crazy adventures that his friend had, and that was and there was one article I didn't really talk too much about it, that where Guy had kind of made this kind of joke about all the rumors and like the stories that were going around about Hemingway, and that he was a writer who was living in this small apartment and they were just feeding him booze, and he was handing pieces of writing out through the door. But the article was actually he was trying to respond to someone who Hemingway was fighting with at the time, who said that he was a wife beater. This was I think Robert McAlmon. He was fighting with at the time. So it was Guy was basically kind of writing the article to set the record straight for his friend. But there's a letter where he said to him, he says, for somebody who's become as popular as you are, you really need to have a thicker skin. You really shouldn't be so thin-skinned, because I think he wasn't exactly happy about being the kind of the press office for his friend after a certain point.
Yeah, because it's funny because the mythology becomes the mythology overtakes the biography or even the work sometimes. I bet there's been plenty of people in this world who would have a sense of Hemingway that might not have read the work. I mean, he becomes that larger than life.
And it's kind of what I found interesting too in their correspondence is that Guy was aware of the fact that Hemingway had, as he put it, he said, well, you try to appear hard boiled, but you have this soft yolk inside you, that is more interesting to me than the kind of the hard boiled persona. And I think that was one of the things that I guess he offered as a friend, is that he saw through a lot of that stuff and liked him anyway. I mean, that was pretty much, he really wasn't looking for the fist fighting drunk sort of adventurer. He saw him as a younger writer who had a very sensitive side, I suppose.
Right, yeah.
You could relate to.
Yeah, exactly. Those are different characters. I mean, because sorry, just jumping around, because I think that the book is fantastic, but there's a lot of things. There's a lost generation literary history. There's the Hemingway, but then there's the story of your grandfather, and in a sense, our great grandfather, the story of yourself too. Because I think what gets forgotten in a lot of the going to running of the bulls and getting drunk at the cafe is that people were there working. Like, Guy has a wife and he has kids and he has a gig and he's got responsibility. And he's a working writer. He's a working man, So I think, it wasn't all fistfights in cafes.
And he was from a sort of a different background too than Hemingway, because he came from a much more difficult kind of background. He had a father who was a drunk, at least. Probably abusive, and quite likely either abandoned his mother, or his mother fled with him when he was fairly young, when he was just in adolescence. Took him from the small town in Ohio, that is still a small town in Ohio, to New York to start over again. And he very young got a job as a sort of a cub at Harper's, and sharpening pencils for Willa Cather, and this sort of thing. And so he started working really early and just kept working, and just kind of kept constantly working. And I mean, Hemingway was from a somewhat more comfortable background, although he had similar kind of experience of well, I guess a father abandonment. His father killed himself, and so they sort of, I think, bonded over that. But I think that, yeah, I mean, Guy was somebody who, it was a source of anxiety for him to keep working, especially after coming back from Paris. But while they were in Paris, he filed a lot of stories, filed quite a few.
I bet there's just that tradition. Like, I mean, you think about the Brooklyn Eagle. You mentioned Willa Cather. I mean, he met Juna Barnes. I mean, the tradition of the paper. With Walt Whitman, wasn't he the editor? I mean, just to walk into that kind of tradition, it must be amazing.
Yeah, it was, and I think he came from one of, I guess, the people who was important for Guy when he was growing up, who I think was a bit of a mentor, was Lincoln Steffens. And so it's that kind of whole tradition of sort of muckraking, writing about really from the perspective of the people, from the kind of working class perspective. And I guess a lot of it was sort of taking on kind of the big business, and Steffens was a bit more sympathetic to the Russian Revolution, but they reconnected pretty quickly in Paris. So they were, that was kind of, I think, where some of that influence came in his writing as well.
Yeah, I can see that because there's other stuff. Like, say, I mean, I was, as I said, to me, the idea of how the Bureau functioned in terms of the American soldiers still in Paris. But also, we have this sense there's a bunch of foreigners in the cafes. In a weird way, the French don't exist. They're put a bit to the margins. But it sounds like, from the book, you talk about him writing pieces about just Parisian life, street culture, working culture, just people doing their thing, explaining to the Americans, giving them a little bit of color. You don't hear so much about that in the book. You just hear about the expatriate scene.
Yeah, and I think he was kind of unique in that he was apparently fairly fluent. And my grandparents, well, my grandfather and my great aunt were both raised speaking French. Had to like pick up a lot of English when they came back when they were teenagers. But I think a lot of those writers were kind of insulated from it. A lot of them kind of sort of stuck to their crowd. And yeah, Guy was fairly unique in that he wrote a lot about like the working class dances and things like that, and then about the people who were working in the restaurants. I mentioned Orwell, who was a plongeur, he was a dishwasher in the bowels of one of these huge hotel restaurants at the same time as Guy was writing about all of those people who were working in the restaurants doing those kind of jobs to entertain the tourists. But he was also writing too, I mean, about going to those cabarets and things, and enjoying the nightlife quite a bit. But I think that, because he was a family man, he kind of had to hang back from that a little bit. A lot of people went over. I mean, this was too, there was the prohibition going on, and quite a bit of sort of moral crusades going on in the States. So a lot of people did come over and really lived it up. and I think he talks a little bit there about having to deal with some of the Americans who didn't know anyone in Paris, but somebody had to get them out of trouble because they had gotten themselves thrown in jail. And he ended up being more of kind of the responsible family man than the sort of than I think people like Hemingway were ended up being.
Yeah, and I guess also part too of history, because as it gets later into the later 20s, I mean, the rise of fascism. I mean, he goes to Germany, he goes to Italy. I mean, he wasn't just aware of this sort of change in European politics. He reported on it, and he went and actually saw it live. That's the part I wasn't expecting. I was just got in my head when I started the book thinking more about Hemingway, lost generation literature, but that was a whole other interesting angle to it.
Yeah, he ended up interviewing Mussolini and Woodrow Wilson, Gabriele D'Annunzio, which was one of my favorite sort of forgotten Italian nationalist poet kind of nut job. And then with Hitler, when Hitler came to power, he went to Berlin during the anti-Jewish boycott that they had. And he wrote about it. And I suppose maybe part of it was that he was writing for a Brooklyn audience too, but he was very, very sensitive about how dangerous this was and how it wasn't, Hitler wasn't going to turn out to just be a flash in the pan kook, that he was going to end up being really dangerous. And one of the things that was sort of interesting is when he was there during the bonfires, during the book burnings, he wrote about the sort of strange feeling of seeing himself burned in the bonfire, because by that point, Hemingway's book, Men Without Women, had come out, which has a story, that's a true story about Guy and Ernest driving around fascist Italy. So he is the guy in the story, and he talks about how, seeing, I think the German is, Manner or whatever the name is for Men Without Women, and seeing them burning this book as one of the supposedly decadent books, and trying to argue that he thought he was actually kind of a moral figure in this story, that it could be a great example for the German youth if they weren't burning it. But at a certain point, he tried to kind of make light of it. He was a fairly witty writer, but he was also pretty quickly horrified by what was happening in Germany, and wrote about it. It was one of those nice things, because you hear about it from your family growing up, that he was one of the people who really early recognized the dangers of the Nazis. And you think, okay, well, maybe they're exaggerating a little bit, but he was, in 1933, it was just about every issue he was writing an article warning about Hitler and about the Nazis.
In terms of your research, I mean, I assume a lot of this is being archived. Were you able to access all his writing, or was there stuff you couldn't access? Or?
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, I used the Brooklyn Public Library was really helpful. And just in a time where libraries are also hurting for funding, I really appreciated they had not only digitized everything, but they were able to send me some articles that he'd written for little like newsletters and things that just had ended up getting archived at the Brooklyn Daily Eagle archives in their morgue. And so they just said, oh, well, we don't have very much, but we have this article, this little newsletter thing he wrote that they sent to me that was about him getting married, about him and my great grandmother getting married and their wedding day, which I'd never heard about anywhere else. And so that was really helpful. The Yale collection, they had the Ezra Pound stuff. Unfortunately, that came right after the book got published, because there was a little letter in there about how he really didn't care for the radio. He ended up working in radio after the war. He ended up working for NBC Radio, but it's just kind of funny because it's a guy talking about it who doesn't really much care for how people sound on this new radio thing. And that was pretty helpful. And then my family had kept copies of all of his letters to Hemingway and back. They've all been donated to the Carlos Baker collection, but they kept Xerox copies of them, which was
yeah.
nice.
And I think you mentioned too that, I mean, you see references to rare books out there inscribed by people like Pound and Hemingway to your great grandfather. That must be kind of funny.
It's a little bit, as a bibliophile and somebody who reads constantly, it is slightly disappointing when there's, you'll see these things at Sotheby's about this book that's been sort of, through however many auctions and is now getting auctioned again, and I can't really afford it. But there's one, I think it was Henry Miller. It was Henry Miller to my friend Guy Hickok, who took me in when I showed up like a beggar in Paris. The first edition Obelisk Press of Tropic of Cancer. So it's like
by rights, it should be yours. You get to look into that.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it would probably be, on the bookshelf and or under glass, or the cat would have chewed it up. So I mean, I can't say it would be in better shape, but yeah, it's interesting to see that kind of stuff show up. And then little strange things that will pop up. A lot of the stuff that he wrote when he was working for NBC Radio, he would like do little interviews and articles that all somehow ended up online. And so it's been, the internet has been a great thing. And in fact, a friend of my father's who read the book recently sent me all of the travel information for my great great grandmother when she came over to Paris, which I have no idea where you would find that online because I'm not. I'm more of an old archive kind of person, but it was kind of an amazing thing to show up in the email as an
Oh, wow.
attachment recently.
What is it just in like the general picture? I mean, why do you think? What is this like this enduring interest in the lost generation? It's never really gone away. Things, literature go in and out of fashion, and as writers get forgotten, and but there's always, and I can say as someone who's worked in bookshops, that stuff still sells. You think, oh, we got enough Hemingway till you go to the shelf and realize you're out again. I mean, slowly but surely, there always seems to be a new a generation of young people that will gravitate towards those writers.
Yeah, I think for me, I mean, it's funny, I maybe kind of rebelling against my upbringing. I kind of came to it late. Um, but I think, what still resonates with me, and I mean, I think of, people like, Joyce and Virginia Woolf and people like that too, is that it's very direct. It's very direct writing. It's, really a lot of stuff about kind of the inner life of kind of nobodies that I find still appeals to me. You read the stuff before that, and I love a lot of 19th century writing, but you get to like this period in the 20s, and all of a sudden the stuff just feels contemporary,
Yeah.
and I think that some of it was kind of coming out of the war and having this kind of just sense of this mission to do it and to do it now and to kind of write things that people that will resonate with this generation. And I think it's still, a lot of it still resonates today for that reason, maybe.
I wondered, and there was a quotation from the book, and I was going to read it aloud, but that's too academic. Screw it. But the general idea was, and it struck me about, they say the coming rise of fascism in Europe when he's writing about it, about just this sort of weird sense of uncertainty. Like something's coming, we don't know what it is. And it struck me as very contemporary. I mean, a young person right now saying, housing crisis, where I'm going to live, I'm going to go off to this other town. Oh, climate change is coming. Everything, it just had a very contemporary feel. I hadn't actually thought about that till reading your bit on that.
Yeah, it was something that struck me too, because you would have like this, generation that went through. I mean, there's this mass migration in the United States because all of these people who, generations have been farmers. Well, there was a global grain crisis, and so there was, a drop in the global grain market. So everybody ended up having to move to the cities where they were working these jobs at kind of at at the force of these, these kind of larger forces, I guess, vulnerable to these larger forces that didn't really make a lot of sense. And then, the rise of this kind of idea of the nation and of, races and all of these larger contexts that didn't really seem like the human individual could comprehend or respond to them. I think that was what a lot of the journalism, I mean, that was what was great about it for me, was how much of it was about trying to make sort of the plight of the individual comprehensible, and not kind of writing in this large abstract way about these things, but actually, Guy was great at finding the scared young soldier in the Ruhr Valley when the French have occupied it, and interviewing him about what it's like to be 15 years old or 16 years old and terrified that you're going to end up having to shoot a civilian, and all these things that really made it human. And I think it was probably what the readers back home could understand, but I think it's the same with a lot of the writing from that time. A lot of stuff, the Hemingway stuff that appeals to me, and it's really a short period, honestly. But are the stories that are about individuals trying to make sense of a world that's fairly hard to understand at that time.
Yeah, and then I suppose part of it, well, part of it too, that sort of, I guess, I mean, your own story. I mean, it's obvious. You're an expat.
Yeah.
Why did you come to Hamilton, Ontario, the Paris of North America?
Well, I mean, it's funny because it was an interesting time to be writing it because I had not. I mean, I was married to a Canadian, and that kind of ended at the end of graduate school, at the end of getting my PhD, having really no idea what in the world I was going to do with my life at a middle age, and so there was a lot that I could relate to, and then of just kind of. A sense of like, how do you get by? And then, we've had all these kind of large scale forces in Hamilton where, the rent in the last 5 years has doubled and in some places tripled. And all these things were a bit, overwhelming. So I think I kind of could relate to just that feeling with Guy of trying to connect with others on an individual level and write about that, and then also just trying to kind of keep working and keep your head above water and try to have a little bit of a sense of what's going on. I don't know that journalism necessarily serves that function anymore, but I think that like the people he was writing for, he was fairly aware of that the world can be made comprehensible for kind of ordinary people. If you
Right. But does that sense of dislocation ever, does that ever, in terms of yourself being a writer, that sense of dislocation ever play into it? Like, I think, what's the line? It's Julio Cortázar, is it? The only true exile is the writer in his own country.
it is, and like I mean, lately I've lived in Canada for about 16 or 17 years. I've never felt Canadian. I mean,
Yeah,
America
we call
is
you the foreigner.
yeah.
Here comes the foreigner.
Yeah, I've never quite gone native, and then I mean with the States, that at the time that I left, it was the early years of the Iraq war, and I mean it felt completely foreign there too. It felt like an alien place. So I have yet to quite to quite land, but I definitely could yeah relate to that. Although it's definitely and also I spent probably about a year in France anyway when I was doing my graduate work. So I also know that can be a challenge to make your way in France and kind of get used to the rhythms of life there. And I didn't have an expat community there that I was
Right.
talking to. But I will say,
Sitting in the cafe on your own with your laptop, it's not quite the 20s, but it's.
yeah, and I was in smaller areas than Paris too. So I was in those places where you kind of had to learn to speak French pretty quickly. Whereas I think Paris is a little bit easier for kind of getting.
Yeah, I guess the one thing that's right I didn't mention off the top. I apologize to anyone viewing. I get excited. I want to jump right into this. Is that we generally do these things about an hour, so about 8 o'clock. But if we need more time, that's fine. We can do it. But one thing I forgot to say is, anyone watching has questions, please send them in. If you have questions for Rufus, we're more than happy to do that. It always a Q&A section. Sorry, I apologize. My partner Jen is usually the Zoom runner here. I don't know how this works, but apparently there's a question section. We can keep talking, but anyone else can jump in too.
Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's anything else I wanted to get to. I was gonna say for sources, one of the things that was really great was that my great aunt. No, it's not my great aunt. It was my aunt. Sorry, my great aunt had passed it on to my aunt. So sorry to my aunt. I still had the letters between my great grandparents when they were first courting and getting to know each other, and those were fantastic. Those were really great because my great grandmother, she wrote a little bit for the paper. She wrote some articles for the paper, but not as frequently. And so I didn't really know her as well. And I realized, I think when I found those, that was kind of for me, the heart of the story was, and probably for Guy too, if you asked him what his life was about, it really was about his marriage and his children. And for that community, for the kind of writing colony community, healthy marriages were not that common. There was quite a few people who ended up, and Hemingway ended up, with more than one wife, and but they stayed together and they stayed in love pretty much until his death. So that was to me, that was kind of the heart of the story.
Mm-hmm. That's wild. And it's wild too. You just had all that material. I've been thinking about some of my family history, and I've got a funny character, a great grandfather character who was not a footnote. He was, he actually went around. I think he was a bit of a drunk, but he went around sort of pretending he was a writer, and he told a lot of people he was a writer. But we've not been able to uncover any of this writing. So at least it's great to have these source materials. My guy's not even a footnote. I'm not sure what. I think he was just a town drunk. Oh, we got a question here. Who's that from?
Ruthie.
Oh, a question from Ruthie. Do you think you'll write another book on the family?
I don't know. I'm working on another book. I am, working on turning the dissertation into a book. So that's on the French Romantic authors and the beginnings of tourism, sort of proto-tourists. And it's, again, a story about writers who are traveling all over the world and having kind of, crazy adventures. So I guess I will say that living in a sort of small city in Canada, I do have a bit of wanderlust. So,
that can happen.
So I think I'm kind of naturally drawn to stories about, people's travels. I do think there's like a lot of material about that era that I'd like to write more about. I'd like to, find out more. And there's definitely enough where I'm trying to learn how to do sort of a little website, create a little website where I can put sort of some of the stories that, didn't end up in the book, or maybe they'll be, in the second edition, but there's quite a lot that didn't quite fit that was still pretty interesting.
And I guess you're seeing more stuff, like you mentioned, the stuff about the immigration documentation. Now that it's out in the world, who knows who will come out, who will come forward. There could be a lot more things. The book could bring more stories to you.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting time. There's one of the things that was, sort of frustrating, sort of interesting was how many, I think we talked about this a little bit earlier before we started. How many people he knew who, the people who were celebrities at the time. Like he has an article, a story about going out drinking with Homer Croy, who, who maybe are forgotten about now, and how many people he knew and just didn't think he should write an article about. Maybe they asked him not to, but there's, they spent a summer with Edna St. Vincent Millay, having lunches with her for a summer when she was in Paris, and he didn't really mention that. That sort of stuff kind of drove me a little bit nuts. There's one letter where he's talking to Hemingway about seeing, I saw Scott on the train, and he was asking if he was drunk the last time I saw him at the party. And I said, well, I've never seen you sober, so how would I know? So it's this sort of right. Joke about Scott Fitzgerald, but there's no article. He didn't write like an article about how he knew him or that sort of thing. So there's definitely a lot of material.
We have another question come in here from Emily. Has writing this book made you feel differently about the literary legacy you inherited, and the one you want to leave behind?
It was interesting reading his writings. One of the things that was strange for me is how much my great grandfather sounded like me. I felt like in his writing, he kind of wrote in a similar style. I never met him because he died in, I think it was 1951. So, but I guess, just being around my family, maybe there's a sort of a family sense of humor, but really just getting a book done and kind of out there in the world, it's made me just want to do that all the time. It definitely is a great, it's a great feeling. And I hope that this is the first of many books.
Would you write on that period again, the Lost Generation, even if it wasn't your family, or like, because I know you studied the Romantics. I mean, you got other things to talk about, but or you're still in that world, you're still in that time period in your imagination.
I think right now with my imagination, I'm definitely back with the Romantics, and the the sort of the French stuff I studied. But the one thing, you'll find these little stories when you're reading old newspapers that are pretty fascinating. And one of the things that kind of kept coming up that was that era, but not really to do with the Lost Generation. It's an American paper, and this is the 20s, so it's the rise of the Klan and the KKK, and there's a whole bunch of stories about different groups that formed in response as sort of secret societies to go fight the Klan, and going and having these sort of gun battles with groups of blacks and Jews who got together to go fight the Klan. And it's a fascinating, these little stories. And I thought, well, if I could find out more about this would be amazing. This would be a great story to write about. So there's a lot of things that just reading the paper, little stories that kind of that come up that become kind of dream books. And that was one that I think was pretty fascinating. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely plenty to write about with the Lost Generation. There's a lot of people there that it's sort of harder to get a handle on too. There's a lot of writers. One of the ones that sort of drove me nuts a little bit was that my great grandmother, in an interview she did later in her life, remembered that Thomas Wolfe had thrown them a party when he was in Paris, and I love Thomas Wolfe, and that was the only thing that apparently he was friends with them, which would make sense, but I'd like to find out a little bit more about him.
Oh, sure, yeah, I bet. Yeah, there's tons. I mean, did they come across Joyce? I don't recall that in the book. I mean, it's a pretty heavy figure. He must have been there, but
Yeah, in the letters they talked about it. In the letters, Guy would talk about sort of seeing him out when they were out eating or whatever. And I think I got the feeling that Hemingway was a bit in awe of Joyce. I got the feeling that he believed that he was he loved Ulysses, and I got the feeling that both of them were a little bit in awe of Joyce. I don't think there were any articles about him. There was kind of an interesting thing. The family had remembered. I think I've heard that they knew Picasso pretty well, and he has a story about going out drinking with Picasso. That's I thought, well, I'd like to know a little bit more about that too. That would be of interest.
Oh, for sure. Any more questions there?
No, I think those.
Is there anything else that you want to say, Rufus? I know I'm sort of jumping around. I mean, that's why I love chatting with you about this stuff.
Oh, another one.
I've got particular interest in that period history too, so I'm just going to start just naming writers because I want a story. Oh, it looks like we have another question.
Maryland.
Question from Marilyn. Would you ever consider writing a fictionalized story based on an historic event?
Yeah. I mean, I've thought about it. I thought about doing it. I just read one of the books that I can't remember the name of it. It was really interesting that I got from the bookstore. That's basically about Abby Hoffman. I think it's sort of a fictionalized, and then some of the characters in it are like Phil Oakes.
Oh, right, yeah.
The main character is fictional, and I sort of bristled at the idea a little bit. I was like, well, it seems like it's cheating because it's not exactly fiction. But then I thought, well, okay, one of the greatest novels ever is, Madame Bovary, which was a newspaper article that Flaubert read and sort of turned into a fictional story. So that might be an interesting kind of experiment, finding some of the old newspaper stories, find one of the more obscure ones and write a book about it. And there were some really interesting stories. One of the people who I didn't really talk about as much was Franklin. The last name was Frumpkin, yet changed to Franklin. Who was the Jewish, gay Jewish matador from Brooklyn, who ended up being friends with Hemingway. Went over. His father was a Russian immigrant, kind of abusive person, and sort of he ended up moving. He ended up kind of running away to Mexico and became a sign painter there. And at one point, one of his drinking buddies there said, "Well, there's no American who could fight a bull," because they're all whips that none of them could fight a bull. So he ended up becoming he said, okay, I'm going to become a matador. And then he ended up going to Spain and becoming one of the great matadors of that time. And written about in Ernest had the book about, the Death in the Afternoon. It talks about this guy a little bit. But I just thought, well, that's just a fascinating story.
Yeah, I wonder too. I mean, I guess for all of us, we can't help but think about travel at a time like this where we're not going anywhere. But you mentioned the wanderlust. What do you think in terms of the sort of, it's part of the myth of Hemingway, but it's part of the myth of being young too. Do you need to go out? Do you need to travel? Like, does the young writer got to go to the running of the bulls? Or, I mean, again, it's the culture we live in too. Or go get an MFA. And I'm not trying to slag, academic writing programs, but it seems that these days you don't just take off.
Yeah, and I think I think it's kind of a shame. I kind of go both ways about it, because there are a lot of writers who I really love who have a really great sense of the place where they live. And so they'll write about, sort of this small town in the middle of nowhere. And really, I mean, that's kind of their world that they create. But I think that, like, you can kind of get locked in very kind of tiny ways of thinking doing that. I do think that, like, travel is fairly useful, and I regret every day that I can't do it, because
for sure. Because I wonder, I mean, even that idea, the notion of the whole notion of the exile. I mean, Joyce is a great example. I mean, he wrote about one city, but he went away to do it.
Yeah.
Like, just sitting in Hamilton, is this why America percolates in your brain, because you're stuck up here? There's a poor exile.
I think I definitely I definitely appreciate it more when I go back. I mean, it's sort of, it's one of those things, like, what's the Faulkner line about, I don't hate the South, the sort of, I don't, you always have a little bit of a love-hate relationship with the States, but I mean, it's kind of impossible to not, for me to not have some love for a place that gave us, Dorothy Parker and the Marx Brothers and
rock and roll and jazz. There's a whole lot of stuff they did down there. There's some stuff.
Rock and roll and jazz and country and western and all kinds of great music. So and the blues. I mean, it's kind of well, I mean, it's funny you mentioned this, because I have my
right on
about exile American writers. So I mean, I definitely at some point would like to spend more time back home. I'd like to spend more time in the States. Maybe be a snowbird. Maybe actually return to exile. But
so you're gonna be an exile in America, writing the great Hamilton novel. I think that's your mission.
I do. I've thought that, like, something like, writing the Ulysses of Hamilton, trying to recall. You can recreate Hamilton from this book,
Yes. You can write it back to us like Joyce did and ask us how many steps it is somewhere. We'll tell you. We're good for that.
Yeah.
I suppose I don't know if we have any more questions in. We're sort of going on 8. Is there anything anyone needs out there? So I don't want to push you too. I could hammer you with questions about literary history all day, but I do know you're still a bit under the weather.
Yeah, I'm a little bit just about ready to go take a nap.
For sure.
I can't think of anything else. I hope the book. I mean.
Oh, we might have a question here.
Ruthie, let me see if I can get this up bigger for you.
Oh, I can read it here. That's Janet. She's here. Question from Ruthie. This isn't a question, but I just loved how you made my grandfather, who I didn't know at all, into a real person. He was an ordinary guy who lived in extraordinary times and with real world legends, and you made him real to your family. Sorry, Ruthie, that was my bad reading. That was the question.
That was my goal. I mean, that's the thing. It's funny because hopefully other people will buy the book. But I mean, the first audience who I hoped enjoyed it was my family. It was really definitely for my dad and my other relatives. First and foremost, I hope other people enjoyed it. And then I hope that the Hemingway fans will enjoy it, and it's sort of hopefully another side of him. There is, I kind of maybe didn't mention that there are maybe 3 or 4 chapters that actually deal with their adventures together.
Yeah, well, I can say, I mean, again, we've talked, as an outsider, as a Canadian, as a non-academic, I thought the book was fantastic, and I've heard, like I said, a few other people say that. Like, it just really works as a story. It's fascinating. You don't have to be a scholar of literary history, or you don't have to be related to you. It has a lot more legs.
Good. Yeah, I think the thing that I occurred to me at the end of it, when I was finally like just about getting done writing it, was that my great grandfather, his sort of, I don't know, calling in life was to write about very ordinary people and make them relatable and make their kind of, their how they dealt with these larger contexts relatable. And I was like, oh, well, this is kind of what I'm trying to do with my great grandfather. I was trying to do sort of the same thing, take sort of an ordinary person and sort of ennoble him a little bit by showing what his life was about. And I hope, I mean, I'll never know, well, maybe, but I hope if he got to read it, he would feel it was a accurate depiction.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Well, that's great. And we don't want to hold you all night. We can wrap it up there. But of course, the book is The Paris Bureau: How a Brooklyn Journalist Survived Jazz Age Paris with the Help from Ernest Hemingway, Ezra Pound, and his family. Right here. Right here. We've got multiple copies. So, but yeah, thanks a lot, Rufus. Really do appreciate that. And it was great to talk to you about it.
Thank you.
And get well, and we'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, I will stop and buy some books soon.
Right on. All right. We'll see you. Good night.
Yeah, good night.